The fluorescent lights hummed their endless mechanical prayer above Cedar Creek Medical's third-floor ICU, and Katie Morrison moved through it like a ghost who'd learned to take solid form only when necessary. That was the thing about disappearing 18 months ago. The paperwork made it official, but the muscle memory? That never faded. Her hands knew things her mouth would never say. Her eyes calculated angles and trajectories that shouldn't exist in a trauma bay meant for routine cardiac monitoring. She adjusted the fall line on the general's left arm with the kind of precision that made other nurses pause and watch, the kind that made Dr. Pierce's jaw tighten every single time he witnessed it. The write-up would come. She already knew it. Cedar Creek Medical in Savannah carried the weight of a place that had seen better funding and worse decisions. The walls were the color of old dental offices, the kind of beige that made you forget what colors looked like after 8 hours. Katie had worked here for 3 years, 3 years of keeping her head down, of speaking only when absolutely required, of absorbing criticism like a shock absorber absorbs impact. Every insult, every dismissive glance from the attending physicians, every time someone called her just a nurse with the kind of weight that made it an accusation rather than a description. She absorbed it all with the same discipline she'd once used in Kandahar, back when her name wasn't Katie Morrison and her rank was still something that meant something. She touched the inside of her jacket lining once, a reflexive gesture, fingers finding the faded unit patch sewn there, threads worn from operations that officially never happened. 3 seconds of contact. That was all she allowed herself. Then she caught her own reflection in the medication cart's polished steel and folded her hand back down. Morrison, these vitals look reasonable. Dr. Pierce said her last name the way someone might say the word cockroach. He stood in the doorway of Trauma Bay 3, his posture a perfect demonstration of someone who'd never had to prove anything with his hands, only with his credentials and his network and his brother-in-law's position on the hospital board. I'll take it from here. Katie was already out of the way. She'd learned to move like water around obstacles. The patient's BP has been stable at 118/72 for the last 4 hours. Heart rate trending down from the initial 94. His left chest wall showed minor asymmetry on visual assessment. Recommend a chest X-ray to rule out. Recommend. Dr. Pierce's smile was the kind you'd see on a shark if sharks could get board certification. That's the overstepping scope of practice I keep trying to address in your file. He turned to the patient, Marine General Thomas Halloway, according to the chart, 63 years old, combat decorated, eyes sharp as rifle sights despite the cardiac event that brought him in. General, this is exactly what I was explaining. The nursing staff here occasionally loses sight of the hierarchy. I'll be the one assessing, not them. Katie's jaw tightened. Just a millimeter. Barely visible. But the general's eyes tracked it like he'd spent 40 years reading tells in rooms where telling the wrong thing meant someone died. He was watching her now, really watching her, the way a person watches something familiar they're trying to place. Her hands were still steady. Her breathing pattern hadn't changed. She was good at this part, the part where you let someone diminish you and your face stays flat and your voice stays level and nobody gets to know that inside you're running tactical calculations about how many years it would take for this hospital to understand what it lost if you walked out the door. I'm sure she's competent enough for the basics, the general said, his voice carrying the kind of weight that comes from commanding men in places where competence meant staying alive. Looked like a thorough assessment to me. Well, Dr. Pierce said, that's kind of you. The dismissal was exquisite. He turned to Katie without looking at her, which was somehow worse than looking at her. You can handle the charting, Morrison. Just stick to what you observe, not what you interpret. We have doctors for the interpretation part. By 11 that morning, the formal write-up appeared on the unit board. Overstepping scope of practice. Providing assessment beyond RN licensure. Undermining physician authority in front of patients and families. Documentation, multiple incidents of clinical analysis outside appropriate parameters. Katie read it while standing at the printer, her coffee growing cold on the counter behind her. 23 words. That's what it took to make it official. She didn't cry. Not there. Not with 3 other nurses in the break room and the attending round scheduled for noon. She read it once, then twice, then walked away as if she'd been reading someone else's life story. Her left shoulder ached where the old scar lived under her scrubs, phantom pain from something that was supposed to stay buried forever. She reached up without thinking and pressed her hand there, checking the integrity of skin that had already healed 1,000 times. The general's family arrived at 2 o'clock. His daughter, Elena, carried flowers in a vase that probably cost more than Katie made in a week. His son, Marcus, had the same sharp eyes as his father, military family. Katie recognized the bearing. She was checking the monitor settings when Elena approached the foot of the bed. "You're the nurse?" Elena said. It wasn't a question, and it wasn't dismissive. It was the tone of someone trying to triangulate position using available data. "Katie Morrison," Katie said. She kept her eyes on the monitor. Heart rate 78. Sinus rhythm. Stable. "My father asked for you by name this morning. He said you were the one who got the 4 in on the first try yesterday." Elena's voice had that particular quality of daughters who'd spent their lives watching their fathers, learning to read what they didn't say. He doesn't usually praise nurses. He doesn't usually remember their names. Katie's hands adjusted the 4-line with movements that were muscle memory pretending to be present moment consciousness. Angle of insertion. Depth. Confirmation of blood return. Every step executed with the kind of precision that comes from having done it in tents with no electricity, in vehicles moving at tactical speed, in conditions where your next breath depended on someone getting it exactly right. "He's an easy patient," Katie said, her voice barely above a whisper. Professional. Deferential. Everything a nurse without advanced credentials was supposed to sound like. "My father was a combat medic before he became a general." Elena said this like it was a casual comment about the weather. "He says the good ones, the really good ones, they have hands that remember things their brains aren't supposed to know. He said that about you." Katie's eyes found the general's for exactly 1 second. He was watching her with that expression again, the one that said he was listening to frequencies most people couldn't hear. She could feel the machinery inside her, the part that had been officially dead for 18 months, the part that had a rank and a call sign and a unit patch sewn inside a jacket that was supposed to stay hidden forever. She could feel all of it running a diagnostic. But that wasn't the worst part. That came at 4 o'clock when the general's heart rate dropped to 52. Not dangerous yet. Not flatlined. But the trend was the trend, and Katie was already moving. Her hands knew what to do before her brain caught up. 2 fingers on the carotid. Checking perfusion. The pulse was there but weak, the kind of weak that preceded not being there at all. She was reaching for the call button when Dr. Pierce appeared in the doorway, his expression suggesting he'd arrived specifically to find something wrong with her. "I need to get the attending," Katie said. Her voice was level. Professional. The voice of someone asking permission, not stating fact. "The vitals look fine to me," Dr. Pierce said. He was already moving toward the general's bed, already positioning himself to take over the narrative. Heart rate in the 50s is normal for this age group. Especially post-cardiac event. Heart rate dropped from 78 to 52 in the last 8 minutes, Katie said. And his BP is trending down. 118 to 112 to 108. He's pale. "I'm concerned about." Concerned. Dr. Pierce smiled that shark smile again. "There's that scope creeping again, Morrison. You're not a cardiologist. You don't diagnose concerns. You monitor and report. The monitoring is fine. The patient is stable." The general's eyes were closed. His breathing was shallow. Katie could see the asymmetry in his chest wall now, the same asymmetry she'd mentioned 4 hours ago, the one Dr. Pierce had dismissed without reading her note. Tension building on the left side. Pressure. The kind of pressure that kills in slow motion if nobody notices it in time. She did not argue. She did not raise her voice. She wiped a tear that had escaped before she could stop it, just one, just enough that she had to notice and correct it, and her eyes found the general's daughter. "Your father is stable," Katie said. Her voice was barely above a whisper, each word placed with the precision of someone who'd learned that the most dangerous things are said quietly. For now. I'll be right here if anything changes. She kept her eyes on Elena's, never breaking contact even though Dr. Pierce was already leaving, already dismissing the concern, already confident in his own infrastructure of authority and board connections and a brother-in-law who could make problems disappear. Katie had been questioned by better men than him. She'd been interrogated by people whose job was knowing when someone was lying. She'd survived things that left scars under her clothes and in the architecture of her hands. One tear was all she'd allowed. Now her face was clear again, and only the general was watching her, and something in his expression said he'd just heard a frequency that most people couldn't. The monitor continued its steady beeping. The fluorescent lights continued their mechanical prayer. And Katie Morrison stood at the foot of a Marine general's hospital bed, her hand steady, her breathing controlled, her eyes fixed on the next 3 minutes because that's how long she calculated before his body would tell her what Dr. Pierce refused to understand. The 3 minutes stretched like hours. Katie stood at the general's bedside during morning rounds, her fingers already reading his pulse before Dr. Pierce swept through the doorway with the kind of entrance that required an audience. The general's daughter sat in the visitor's chair, her purse clutched like a life raft. His son stood near the window, arms crossed, watching. Katie was charting vitals, blood pressure 142/88, heart rate steady at 76, oxygen saturation 97% on room air, when Dr. Pierce stopped mid-stride and fixed her with the look of a man who'd just noticed a stain on his sleeve. Nurse, nobody here seems to think she can diagnose better than physicians. His voice moved through the room like cold fog. Tell me, where did you complete your medical degree? Oh, that's right, you didn't. The general's daughter shifted. Katie took one breath. Just one. Her hands didn't falter on the clipboard. She met his eyes and said, I document what I observe, doctor. Nothing more. A single tear escaped. She wiped it without breaking eye contact, her face remaining flat as a battlefield. Dr. Pierce waited for her to crumble further, to stammer an apology, to prove his point. She didn't. She simply turned back to the general and finished her assessment as if he weren't standing there at all. That restraint, that refusal to give him the satisfaction of her shame, infuriated him more than any outburst could have. By noon, a formal write-up was posted on the unit board. Her name, highlighted in red marker. Overstepping scope of practice. Unauthorized assessment techniques. Diagnostic overreach. Junior nurses glanced at it, then glanced away, the way you look at a car accident on the side of the highway. Katie stood in front of it for exactly 15 seconds, reading every word, then walked to the supply closet and retrieved the tray of saline flushes that needed restocking. The break room smelled of reheated coffee and the particular emptiness of fluorescent lighting. Katie sat at the table with her lunch, a sandwich from the cafeteria, some fruit, a yogurt she'd brought from home, and unwrapped the sandwich without ceremony. She was 3 bites in when Dr. Pierce entered, checked his phone with performative distraction, and announced to the room, strange how some people end up in nursing when they couldn't handle real medicine. The words were calibrated for maximum damage. One by one, staff collected their food and left. The surgical tech. The respiratory therapist. The phlebotomist. By the time Katie looked up, she was alone, her sandwich still half-eaten on the table in front of her. The pattern repeated across 7 days. Pierce called her Nurse Nightingale during shift changes with a smile like a knife. Perhaps Nurse Nightingale can enlighten us with her unauthorized assessment techniques. He questioned her charting in front of patients, made comments about how strange it was that her observations were always so precise, so beyond what a bedside nurse should notice. During a code blue on Friday morning, she performed a resuscitation protocol with the kind of flawless efficiency that came from hands trained in forward surgical teams. He arrived afterward, chest rising with indignation, and announced loudly enough for the entire trauma bay to hear, "Cowboy medicine. This is why we have hierarchies, people." What he didn't know was that the general was watching. From his bed during rounds, from the hallway during ambulation, from the moment Katie entered his room until the moment she left. The general's eyes tracked her movements with the precision of someone trained to read body language. He saw the way she positioned herself during assessments, not like a nurse, but like a combat medic conducting a field evaluation. He saw the way her hands moved when she changed his dressing, the muscle memory of someone who'd held pressure on wounds that would have broken a lesser person. On Tuesday afternoon, during supervised courtyard ambulation, Katie walked beside the general's footpole, monitoring his gait and his vitals. The March sun was warm against her scrubs. She was counting his steps mentally, 83 so far, when something in her peripheral vision changed. The way light reflected off metal. The angle of a man's shoulders. The erratic rhythm of someone whose nervous system was drowning in adrenaline. Recognition hit like muscle memory. PTSD episode, untreated, armed. General, we need to go inside. Now. The command in her voice erased 18 months of subservience in a single sentence. Captain Catherine Morrison reasserted herself for exactly the time it took to save a life. Dr. Pierce appeared in the courtyard doorway, his face already shaped into annoyance. Nurse, nobody giving orders again? The general needs his exercise. Katie didn't acknowledge him. She positioned herself between the general and the window, her body a barrier. Through the glass, she saw the man's hand shake as it rose. Saw the barrel angle toward the courtyard. Saw the moment his finger tightened. 3 gunshots. The window exploded inward, 1,000 fragments of glass and hospital-grade safety material scattering like shrapnel. Katie moved on pure instinct, 18 years of combat training compressed into 2 seconds. She shoved the general down, covering him with her body as metal and glass tore through the air. Shrapnel embedded in her left shoulder. Her ribs. Pain bloomed white-hot, electric, splitting her concentration into survival and mission. Blood soaked through her scrubs instantly, spreading across the fabric in dark blooms, copper bright against white cotton. The general's fur line tore free. His access site began to bleed. Katie's right hand clamped pressure on the wound, muscle memory taking over, the motion automatic as breathing. Her left arm hung useless, screaming. She couldn't lift it. She could only maintain pressure with her right hand while her vision started to gray at the edges. Stay down, sir. Maintain position. Her voice was steady. Control was the only thing left she could offer. Security tackled the shooter, a Marine veteran, eyes wild, lost somewhere in Kandahar province 4,000 miles from his body. Dr. Pierce stood frozen in the doorway, untouched, watching the blood spread across tile like it was someone else's emergency. Paramedics arrived. They tried to move her first, tried to treat the bleeding in her shoulder, tried to lay her on a stretcher. Katie's grip on the general's foresight didn't loosen. Her voice came out hoarse, non-negotiable, patient first. Always. Only when the general was stabilized on a gurney, his vitals being called out by a trauma surgeon, did she allow them to move her. She lay down on the stretcher with the deliberate slowness of someone who'd already calculated the damage. Her left shoulder felt like it was on fire. Her ribs screamed with each breath. But her eyes kept scanning the room for threats, kept tracking the general's location, kept assessing the threat level even as consciousness started to gray at the edges and the world reduced to the sound of sirens and the smell of blood on tile and the feeling of her own hands finally letting go. The next words out of Dr. Pierce's mouth, as they wheeled her past him toward the ER, were the ones that changed everything. The courtyard was wide and bright, the savannah sun flattening everything into shades of white and gray. Katie wheeled the four-stand beside the general's wheelchair, her hand steady on the push bar, watching his face soften as he felt the warmth on his skin. 3 days post-surgery and he was clearance for supervised ambulation outside the ER walls, a small victory that the team had documented with careful precision. The general's breathing was easier now, the tension pneumothorax completely resolved after that needle decompression 3 days ago, his O2 sat holding at 98% on room air. She noticed the man in the parking lot before the general did. Khaki cargo pants, military-issue boots worn at the heels, shirt unbuttoned despite the heat. He paced in short, jagged lines between the vehicles, not the movement of someone searching for their car. The movement of someone whose nervous system was firing on all frequencies at once. Katie's peripheral vision caught the tremor in his hands, the way his jaw worked, the repetitive step-stop pattern. She'd seen this before. In forward surgical tents. In armored convoy debriefings. In the eyes of men whose brains had learned that safety was a lie. "General, we're going to head back inside," Katie said quietly, her voice carrying no alarm, no urgency, just a simple statement delivered like a nurse mentioning the time. "We just got out here," he said, but he didn't argue. Something in her tone had registered. Something had always registered with him. She turned the wheelchair toward the courtyard entrance when the man in the parking lot stopped pacing. His right hand moved to his hip. Not reaching for keys. Not reaching for a phone. Reaching inside his waistband with the mechanical precision of someone executing a sequence he'd rehearsed 1,000 times in the dark. Katie had exactly 1 second to choose. The courtyard doors were 30 feet behind them. The man was 40 feet away. The parking lot stretched between them like a runway, and above it, the afternoon sky arched open and indifferent. In that 1 second, her hands moved. Not from thought. From survival. From muscle memory that lived deeper than consciousness, deeper than 9 years of scrubs and stethoscopes, all the way down to the part of her brain that had trained in Kandahar under fire instructors whose names she couldn't say anymore. The first shot cracked across the parking lot like a whip. Katie's body moved forward and down, her left arm sweeping the general's wheelchair handle as she pivoted her entire frame over him, shielding him the way you'd shield an ammo cache or a radio operator, with your body, with your life, with the absolute certainty that he was the priority. Her right hand gripped the wheelchair frame. Her left arm came up and around his shoulder. She was already moving them toward the doors, already calculating angles, when the second shot punched through the courtyard window 6 feet to their right. The glass exploded inward with a sound like ice breaking across a frozen lake, a shower of glittering fragments that fell like snow. But behind the glass came something else, something sharp and hot and singular, moving so fast it was only visible as a blur. Shrapnel. A shard of window frame, jagged and spinning, traveling at terminal velocity. It caught Katie across the left shoulder, tore through the soft tissue above her collarbone with the sensation of being struck by a burning knife. She didn't stop moving. Didn't cry out. Pain was information. Pain was data. Pain was something you filed away and processed later, in a quiet room, when the patient was stable and the bleeding had stopped. 3 more shots. 4. The courtyard erupted into screaming, visitors frozen in confusion, staff members running for cover. But Katie was already pulling the wheelchair backward toward the entrance, her left arm hanging at an angle that wasn't quite right, her hand still locked on the forestand, her body still positioned as a shield. The general was trying to turn his head, to see what had happened, to assess the threat, but his post-surgical frame wasn't capable of the movement. "Keep your eyes forward," Katie said. Her voice was steady. Almost gentle. The voice of someone giving instructions during a routine procedure, not instructions during an active shooting. "We're going inside. You stay focused on your breathing. In for 4 counts. Out for 6. He did what she told him to do because she'd already proven, across 3 days of recovery, that she knew how to read every warning sign his body sent. She'd known before the monitor knew. She'd caught his hand when it trembled and held it without comment. She'd adjusted his position when pain started before he could tell her it hurt. Security burst through the courtyard doors, 3 officers moving in practiced formation, weapons drawn but held low, scanning the parking lot with the trained awareness of men who understood angles and sight lines. The shooter was still firing, but now erratically, his hands shaking, his breathing ragged. One of the security officers, an ex-Marine named Garrett, according to his name tag, moved with the same precision Katie recognized in herself. He didn't hesitate. He didn't announce himself. He moved like someone who'd trained in rooms where hesitation meant body bags. Katie pulled the wheelchair through the doors. They were inside now, the cool air of the interior washing across her face, the fluorescent lights humming their constant surveillance hum above them. Her left arm was wet. Not bleeding through the medical tape yet, but the sensation of warm liquid running down her ribs told her the wound extended deeper than the shoulder, that something had entered through the upper lateral chest wall and lodged somewhere near the ribcage. She could assess it later. After she made sure the general's V hadn't been compromised in the movement, after she checked his O2 sat one more time, after she confirmed that his post-surgical incision hadn't been disrupted by the jarring movement backward. His vital signs were climbing, heart rate up to 102, blood pressure elevated to 156/89, but that was the body's appropriate response to threat. Not dangerous. Expected. She could work with that. 2 more shots outside. Then silence. Then the blessed, terrible sound of a man being subdued, struggling, crying, hyperventilating, the keening sound of someone whose mind had fractured under the weight of memories his body couldn't process anymore. The ER doors opened before them, and Katie wheeled the general straight through into the controlled environment, her vision narrowing to the specific task: get the patient to a bed. Get him hooked back to continuous monitoring. Verify no new injuries. Then address her own situation. Dr. Pierce stood in the hallway, his face pale, his body still against the wall. He hadn't moved. Hadn't helped. Hadn't even positioned himself defensively. He'd simply stood there while Katie had moved, while the general had been wheeled to safety, while security had neutralized the threat. His eyes followed her now as she pushed the wheelchair past him toward Bay 3, and something flickered behind his pupils, not gratitude, not shock, but something harder and sharper. Calculation. The ER bay was exactly as she'd prepared it yesterday, ready for any crisis, the 4 lines still running, the monitor leads within reach, the blood pressure cuff hanging on the wall in perfect readiness. Katie positioned the wheelchair perpendicular to the bed, locked the brakes, and began checking the generals for line with the same methodical precision she'd used 100 times before. Normal saline still flowing. Tubing patent. No air bubbles. His O2 sat was back to 96% on room air. Breathing slow and controlled because she'd taught him the technique. "You're safe," she said quietly, pressing the button to raise the bed's head. "Your body's going to tell you it's not, but it is. Your breathing is steady. Your heart rate is responding appropriately. You're going to be fine." The nurse manager, Torres, competent and kind, appeared at the bay entrance with a trauma kit. Katie's left arm had stopped moving with the same precision by then. Not from pain. From the simple mechanics of a shoulder wound that had limited her range of motion. But her right hand was still steady. Still functional. Still capable of doing what needed to be done. "Katie, you're bleeding," Torres said, her voice tight. 12 stitches worth, Katie said, not looking away from the monitor. "Shoulder laceration. There's something embedded in the ribs, too deep for immediate extraction, they'll want imaging. Start with the shoulder. I need to finish checking him first." She didn't mention that her own vital signs were climbing now, adrenaline finally catching up with the moment, her heart rate accelerating, her breathing deepening. She pulled the stethoscope from her neck, the one with her call sign etched into the diaphragm, a detail no one had ever questioned, and listened to the general's lungs one more time. Clear. Perfect. The surgery site's clean. Only after she stepped back, only after she confirmed that his post-operative state remained stable despite the violence, did she allow Torres to guide her to the next bay and begin the process of her own assessment. The shoulder wound bled freely once they removed the initial bandaging, a deep laceration running 3 inches along the clavicle. Torres cleaned it carefully, irrigating with saline, while Katie sat on the edge of the examination table and counted the ceiling tiles. "There's more," she said quietly, pulling her scrub shirt up just enough to show the entry wound in her ribs, where the shrapnel had penetrated. The flesh was already darkening, the tissue swelling, a deep purple bloom spreading across her lateral chest wall. Torres sucked in a sharp breath. "That's a chest wound," Torres said. "We need to get you to imaging. That could be a pneumothorax, or hemothorax, or—" "Run the chest X-ray," Katie said. If it's a simple pneumothorax under observation, needle decompression again. I'll tolerate it. If it's bleeding, we'll deal with it after we stabilize it. For now, do the shoulder. 12 stitches. Then bandage the rib wound and get the imaging ordered. The ER attending, a woman named Dr. Reeves, who Katie respected because she listened first and interrupted never, appeared with an ultrasound machine and ran a POCUS exam while Torres worked on the shoulder. The probe moved across Katie's ribs, and on the screen, the ultrasound showed exactly what Katie had already suspected. The shrapnel was lodged between the ribs, embedded but not actively bleeding, held in place by tissue tension and the body's immediate inflammatory response. "We can leave it for now," Dr. Reeves said, her voice carrying the weight of experience. "Get the full imaging to see the trajectory, but if it's stable and not bleeding, surgery can wait. Your vital signs are good. Pain level? Minimal," Katie said, which was true in the way that all pain becomes minimal when compared to the baseline of having survived 3 tours in a war zone. They gave her ibuprofen. She refused anything stronger. The shoulder received its 12 stitches while Katie kept her eyes on the heart monitor above the general's bay, visible through the glass partition, watching his rhythm stay steady and strong. Torres worked carefully, her hand steady because Katie's composure had steadied her, because the message Katie had sent without words was simple: this is manageable. This is normal. This is what we do. By the time Dr. Pierce appeared in the doorway of her bay, Katie was already bandaged, already mobile despite the soreness in her shoulder and the sharp ache along her ribs. He stood there for a moment, his clipboard held against his chest like armor, his eyes moving from her face to her shoulder to the imaging order Torres was processing. "That was extremely reckless," he said finally, his voice tight with something that wasn't concern. "Your response to an active shooter should have been to take cover and call security. Not to move a post-operative patient." Katie looked at him across the distance between them, and something shifted in her expression, not a smile, not aggression, just a slight flattening of her features, a recalibration of her attention toward him the way a sniper recalibrates for wind and distance. "The general needed to be moved," she said quietly. "I moved him. He's stable. His vitals are excellent. His post-operative status remains secure. Your judgment was impaired." "My judgment was correct," Katie interrupted, and the tone of her voice had changed. Not louder. Not aggressive. Just colder. Clearer. The voice of someone who'd learned to communicate in environments where being misunderstood meant body bags. "The patient is safe. The wound is controlled. The general will make a full recovery. If you have clinical concerns, we can discuss them after he's stabilized." Dr. Pierce's jaw tightened. He didn't respond. He simply turned and left, his clipboard pressed harder against his chest, his breathing visible in the tightness of his shoulders. But as he walked away, Katie saw his hand moving already, reaching for his phone, his fingers already dialing, his mind already calculating 3 moves ahead. She didn't know, in that moment, exactly what he was planning. She couldn't have known that he was going to call the hospital board president and shape the narrative before it could settle, before anyone could ask why he'd frozen while a nurse with no advanced degrees had moved with the reflexive precision of someone trained in combat medicine. She couldn't have known that within the hour, he would be on the phone with investigators, that he would be probing her employment history, that he would be building a case that her heroism was actually instability, that her exceptional judgment was actually recklessness, that her shielding the general was the opening move in a game he could finally win. All she knew, as she sat in the ER bay with 12 fresh stitches in her shoulder and shrapnel embedded in her ribs, was that something had shifted. Something had broken. And whatever came next was going to require the same survival skills she'd relied on in Kandahar, except this time there would be no helicopters coming to extract her, no command structure to protect her, no military protocol for a war that was being fought with paperwork and phone calls instead of bullets. The ER around her moved in its organized chaos, monitors beeping, staff calling out vitals, the controlled choreography of emergency medicine playing out in real time. And Katie sat very still, her left arm immobilized by the bandaging, her breathing controlled, her face completely blank, and waited. The boardroom on the 3rd floor smelled like leather chairs and desperation. Dr. Pierce had made exactly 4 phone calls, 1 to the hospital's compliance officer, 1 to his contact at the state medical board, 1 to a private investigator he kept on retainer for situations exactly like this, and 1 to the administrator himself. In each conversation, his voice carried the same measured concern. I'm not trying to be difficult. I'm trying to protect patient safety. A nurse with no credentials performing advanced assessments. We need to look into this. By hour 3, Katie Morrison sat in the administrator's office while a woman named Sandra Chen read aloud from a printed email. Your employment history shows a gap of 18 months. No listed prior facility. No references we can actually contact. Sandra's eyes moved from the paper to Katie's face, searching for answers. The references you provided, Kandahar Medical Clinic, Joint Operations Support Center, neither facility exists in any database we can access. Cedar Creek hired you based on credentials that don't appear to be authentic. Katie sat perfectly still. Her left arm throbbed inside the sling. Blood had seeped through the bandage again, a small rust-colored bloom spreading across the white cotton. She'd refused narcotics. The pain was information. The pain kept her sharp. Captain Morrison, Sandra stopped herself. Ms. Morrison, Dr. Pierce has raised serious concerns about your scope of practice. The formal write-up, the assessment techniques you used with our general's family, the needle decompression you performed in the ER without direct physician supervision. The patient's oxygen saturation was 68, Katie said quietly. Dropping. The physician you're referring to was in the supply closet when the shooter opened fire. Sandra's jaw tightened. She didn't like being challenged. That may be true, but you don't have the credentials to. The patient lived. That's not the point. Sandra folded her hands. The point is documentation and proper channels and liability. You understand that Cedar Creek's insurance doesn't cover procedures performed by unauthorized personnel. If something had gone wrong. His lung had collapsed. His heart was failing. There was no insurance that was going to matter at that point. The silence stretched. Sandra pulled a thick folder across her desk, the kind of folder that meant termination papers were already signed. Already final. I'm suspending you pending a full investigation into your credentials. Effective immediately. Don't report to your shift tomorrow. We'll contact you within 10 business days regarding the outcome of the review. Katie stood. The room tilted slightly, blood loss, exhaustion, the slow burn of betrayal. She steadied herself against the armrest of the chair. And if the investigation clears me, then we'll discuss reinstatement. Sandra wasn't meeting her eyes anymore. But between you and me, Captain, she'd caught herself too late, but the word hung there. Ms. Morrison, Dr. Pierce has very persuasive documentation. References he's contacted. Questions about military service records. There's a pattern here that doesn't add up. By hour 4, the suspension had become a termination. The compliance officer had found an inconsistency in Katie's employment application, a birth date that didn't match a social security number, which was expected when your entire existence had been deleted and reassigned by the Pentagon. Dr. Pierce had contacted the State Board of Nursing directly, citing patient safety concerns. He told the administrator that Katie represented a liability, a fraud waiting to happen, and that her heroic act in the parking lot, rushing toward an active shooter, shielding a patient with her body, wasn't bravery. It was instability. Recklessness. The kind of behavior that suggested Katie Morrison wasn't a nurse at all, but something else entirely. Something unpredictable. The termination letter was brief, effective immediately. Your employment is terminated for falsified employment history and scope of practice violations. Please return your hospital badge and credentials by end of business today. Katie had walked out through the staff entrance, past the loading dock where Dr. Pierce stood watching her go, his expression carefully neutral. He'd won. The network he'd activated, his allies on the board, his contacts in credentialing, his reputation as a serious physician concerned about safety, had done exactly what he'd wanted. It had erased her. Again. By hour 5, Katie sat in an all-night diner on the outskirts of Savannah, 7 miles from Cedar Creek Medical, in a booth by the window. The coffee in front of her had gone cold an hour ago. She stared at her reflection in the glass, pale, hollow-eyed, the white sling stark against her civilian clothes. Blood had seeped through again, a small red bloom on her shoulder where the shrapnel had torn through her. She'd changed the bandage at home, cleaned it herself with the kind of precision that comes from 18 months of burying a life that had already been buried. The diner's fluorescent lights hummed their thin, lonely song. A truck passed on the highway outside, its air brake hissing like something dying. The only other patron was a man in a baseball cap reading a newspaper 3 booths down, and he didn't look up when Katie stared past her reflection into the darkness. She thought about the last 18 months. The careful construction of Katie Morrison, RN, BSN, regular person, unremarkable competence disguised as normal. She'd built it lie by lie, reference by reference, each falsified credential another brick in a wall meant to keep her invisible. And it had worked. Until she did what she was trained to do. Until she moved on instinct and saved a life, and that one act of muscle memory had begun to unravel everything. Disappearing had been the protocol. She should have disappeared. Should have taken a new name, a new state, a new hospital in some town nobody had heard of. Should have made it her mission to be smaller, quieter, more invisible. Instead, she'd tried to be a regular nurse in a regular place, and that had been the mistake. The diner door opened. Michael walked in, and Katie's heart stopped. Her son was 17 years old, with her jawline and his father's broad shoulders, and his face was wet with tears. He was carrying a show box. Not new. Worn brown cardboard, the kind of thing that gets buried in attics and forgotten until it's not. Katie stood before he reached the table. "Michael, what are you doing here? You're supposed to be at school. Who drove you?" He didn't answer. He set the show box on the booth seat and sat down across from her, his hands shaking. "I went through your stuff in the attic. I know you said never to look, but I heard about Cedar Creek, I heard what happened, and Mom, they're saying you lied on your application. They're saying you don't have credentials. But that doesn't make sense because I've watched you work, I've seen what you can do, and Mr. Chen at the hospital called the house asking for documentation of your military service and his voice cracked. I looked." Katie's throat had gone tight. "Michael." "Mom, I found these." He opened the show box. Bronze Star. Purple Heart. Combat Action Ribbon. Citations with her real rank, sealed in plastic, the ink still sharp enough to read. Captain Catherine Morrison, United States Marine Corps. Kandahar Province. Heroism in action. Wounded in action. Service in support of Operation Enduring Freedom. Katie reached for the box with her good hand, instinct screaming to close it, to hide it, to lie one more time and make this moment disappear. But she looked at her son's face, the desperate need to defend her, to prove that she wasn't a fraud, that his mother wasn't a lie, and something inside her that had been holding together since that first shrapnel wound broke open. "They're saying you made everything up," Michael whispered. "That you're not qualified. But these medals, Mom, you earned these. You served. They fired you for saving someone's life, and you're just going to let them." Katie closed the box gently. She looked at her reflection in the diner window, pale, exhausted, the sling white against her shirt. She looked at her son. She looked at the medals. "Okay," she said quietly. "Okay, Michael. We need to show these to someone." They drove back toward Cedar Creek in Michael's old Honda Civic, the show box on Katie's lap, her heart pounding with each mile. She knew what came next. She knew that opening this box meant the end of disappearing, the end of hiding, the end of Katie Morrison, the invisible nurse. She knew that 18 months of careful anonymity was about to become very, very public. But Michael's hand reached over and covered hers on the show box, and Katie squeezed it once and held on. The hospital parking lot looked the same as it had that morning, except now the courtyard had been cleaned of glass and the bullet holes had been marked with evidence tape. She and Michael walked through the staff entrance, past the security desk, up the elevator to the administrative floor. The boardroom was on the 3rd floor. She could hear voices, Dr. Pierce's voice, clipped and dismissive, explaining something to someone with the kind of authority that came from being right about everything. She knocked once. The room fell silent. The boardroom doors opened and Michael Morrison stepped inside, his 17-year-old frame still damp from the November rain, the showbox clutched against his chest like a confession. Katie stood at the far end of the mahogany table, her left shoulder wrapped in fresh bandaging beneath her dress, the fabric fitted carefully to avoid the foresight the ER had left behind. The CEO sat rigid in his leather chair. The hospital board members exchanged glances. Dr. Pierce was already opening his mouth to object when Michael upended the showbox across the polished surface. Bronze Star tumbled first, catching the overhead light and throwing it back like a prayer. Then the Purple Heart dropped. Twice. Then the combat action ribbon cascaded across the wood in a single red and white stream. The room went dead silent. Every eye in that boardroom fixed on Katie. Not the nurse. Not the suspended employee. The woman standing absolutely still, her good hand at her side, her breathing measured and controlled like someone managing pain without complaint. The general, still recovering in the hospital's cardiac wing 3 floors below, had somehow arranged for these medals to travel from whatever secure location held the remnants of her classified service record. Michael had walked into his room yesterday afternoon with questions. The general had answered with a showbox and instructions. The Marine colonel who'd been sitting in the corner, the one nobody had seemed to notice when he'd arrived an hour earlier in dress blues and the kind of presence that made the air pressure change, stood slowly. He reached for a leather folder and opened it with the precision of someone who'd performed this ritual before. His voice was parade ground clear. For extraordinary heroism during classified operations in Kandahar province, Captain Catherine Morrison demonstrated exceptional tactical medical intervention under direct hostile fire, sustained critical injuries while maintaining patient care protocols, and executed advanced surgical techniques in forward operating conditions that saved the lives of 3 service members and 1 high-ranking officer. For this service, and for her continued sacrifice, the Department of Defense awards the following recognitions. Each word landed like a gavel strike. Captain. Not nurse. Not suspended employee. Captain. Katie's hand moved toward her collar, the instinctive motion of someone reaching for dog tags that hadn't hung there in 18 months, the kind of muscle memory that doesn't fade. She caught herself midway and folded her hand back to her side. But the moment was already there, visible, undeniable. The general's code name, Sierra 9, had slipped from his lips in the hallway this morning when Michael mentioned he was bringing the medals. Katie had gone absolutely still. Her son had watched her face and understood that his mother had been living under erasure, that the person the Pentagon had buried was real and alive and sitting across from him at the dinner table. Dr. Pierce stood abruptly, his chair scraping backward with a sound like fingernails on concrete. This is highly irregular. Protocol requires. The hospital CEO raised one hand. It was a small gesture, economical and final. The CEO did not raise his voice. He did not need to. The boardroom doors opened again. A 2-star general walked in. Not a video call from the Pentagon. Not a phone conversation routed through secure lines. A living, breathing major general with command presence that seemed to expand and fill the entire room like oxygen, like something that made all the oxygen suddenly precious and thin. His dress blues carried more medals than Katie's whole medical degree represented in years of study. He did not sit. He did not speak. He simply stepped forward, extended his hand toward the medals scattered across the table, and saluted them with the precision of someone who understood that some pieces of metal meant more than words could ever convey. The silence lasted exactly 3 seconds. Then the CEO stood. Then the board members. Then everyone in that room except Dr. Pierce, who remained seated, his face the color of hospital walls, his mouth opening and closing like a gasping fish. Katie kept her composure. Her hand steady. Her breathing even. The pain in her shoulder had become information, data to be processed and filed away. She'd learned to do that in Kandahar, how to compartmentalize, How to separate the body's screaming from the mind's requirements. Stay present. Stay useful. Don't break. Michael watched his mother with tears streaming down his face. She met his eyes for a single moment and saw the answer to every question he'd ever asked about where she disappeared to for those years. What happened to the person who'd raised him for 16 years before vanishing into classified assignments and erased records? She gave him the slightest nod. I'm sorry. I'm here now. The phone call came exactly 5 hours after the shrapnel had torn through her shoulder. Katie was in the hospital's administrative offices, being formally reinstated with back pay when the CEO's private line rang. He handed the phone to her with something that might have been respect. The voice on the Pentagon secured line was filtered through encryption that made it sound like it was coming from underwater, from somewhere deep and untouchable. But the code name was clear enough to stop her breathing. Sierra 1. The voice using that designation hadn't addressed her by it in 18 months. The last time had been an extraction from a safe house in Farah province, a helicopter ride through sandstorm, and orders to disappear into civilian life, to let the operation be buried, to accept that Captain Katie Morrison no longer officially existed. The voice told her the Secretary of Defense approved her reinstatement. The voice told her Cedar Creek Medical was being recognized as a facility of excellence. The voice told her that several other classified personnel had quietly reached out, asking if Cedar Creek might be a safe harbor for those rebuilding civilian lives. The voice told her to contact no one, that the classification remained in place, that this conversation was not recorded. Then the line went dead. Within 2 weeks, the hospital's investigation into Dr. Pierce's accusations against Katie had expanded into something far uglier than a personnel dispute. The compliance team, now examining his records with genuine scrutiny instead of deferential assumption, found irregularities that made the auditors' faces go pale. A surgical outcome he'd listed as successful, the patient had flatlined 72 hours post-op, cause of death amended after the fact to septic shock from an infection nobody had documented during surgery. A malpractice complaint from 2022 settled quietly with an NDA so tight that even the hospital's legal team hadn't been aware of the details. Surgical logs that showed procedures he'd supervised but never actually performed, credit claimed for work that junior residents had executed under his name. Falsified outcomes across 14 patient files. The State Medical Board opened a formal inquiry within days. Dr. Pierce tried to activate his network, made calls to board members who didn't return them, contacted colleagues who politely indicated they were unavailable, sent emails to hospital administrators that were carefully forwarded to legal counsel. The paper trail led only to him. His power source had evaporated the moment his competence was questioned. Bullies always believe their position is unshakable until the moment it isn't. Katie was offered the position of Director of Trauma Services at Cedar Creek Medical. She accepted without ceremony, with the same quiet dignity that had carried her through 18 months of humiliation. The CEO removed Dr. Pierce's write-up from the unit board personally, that single page of accusations and suspicions, and replaced it with Katie's military commendation, not the full citation, nothing that would compromise classification, but enough that everyone understood. Nurses who'd avoided her in the break room began scheduling their breaks at different times. She didn't punish them. Didn't demand apologies or explanations. Just nodded and returned to work. Dr. Pierce was placed on administrative leave, then suspended, then terminated. His medical license entered review status with the state board. 3 months later, his lawyer negotiated a settlement that included a permanent mark on his record and a restriction on future practice. He was 52 years old and the end of his career had arrived in the span of 6 weeks. 6 months after the shrapnel, Katie stood in her new office on the 4th floor of Cedar Creek Medical, the nameplate on the door still catching the light in a way that made her pause every time she entered. Director of Trauma Services. The title was real now. The authority was real. The respect was real in a way it had never been when she was just a nurse they could dismiss. She'd framed the faded unit patch from her Kandahar jacket, the one she'd kept sewn inside the lining of her flight jacket all these years, the threads worn thin but the insignia still clear. The fraying edges of the patch seemed to hold the entire story, the parts that were classified, the parts that were buried, the parts that had been denied until her son walked into a hospital boardroom carrying proof. Her fingers traced the edge of the frame sometimes, during quiet moments, remembering the forward surgical tent where she'd stitched this patch to her jacket after the shrapnel hit a supply line and she'd run into gunfire to reach a fallen Marine. Through the window overlooking the hospital grounds, movement caught her eye. The loading dock, near the emergency bay. A medical supply van. Someone in scrubs without insignia, unloading boxes with the kind of careful deliberation that suggested the body was doing one thing while the mind was somewhere else entirely. Dr. Pierce. He'd gotten a job with a medical supply company, driving deliveries, handling equipment, existing in the margins of the profession that had rejected him. His eyes lifted toward her fourth-floor window as if sensing her gaze. For a moment, across the distance, their eyes met. His dropped immediately. His shoulders hunched. He turned away and disappeared back inside the van. Katie felt nothing, no satisfaction, no vindication, no sense of righteous triumph. Just the quiet recognition that consequences catch everyone eventually, that the world balances itself if you wait long enough and keep doing the work. Michael visited her office after school, still adjusting to the reality of his mother as director rather than suspended nurse. He touched the framed unit patch gently, running his finger along the stitching. "Mom, are you glad they know now?" Katie considered the question, her fingers tracing the edge of the frame beside his. The two of them stood there in her office, surrounded by trauma protocols and commendations and the physical proof that she'd been more than she'd been allowed to admit. "I'm glad I don't have to hide from you anymore." That was enough. She returned to work, reviewed trauma protocols with the precision of someone who'd learned them in conditions that left no room for error, trained new staff using techniques developed in forward surgical tents where the difference between a trembling hand and a steady one meant the difference between life and flatlined. When a veteran came through the ER with a panic attack, she knew exactly how to approach, exactly what to say, how to make space for someone who'd seen the worst that people could do to each other. Nobody questioned her expertise now. They simply followed her lead and learned. The general sent a handwritten letter, not email, something about the permanence of pen on paper mattered to him, thanking her again and noting that several other classified personnel had quietly contacted him about Cedar Creek as a safe harbor. Katie filed it carefully in a locked drawer. The hospital board issued a formal apology, though she noted the language was more concerned with liability than genuine remorse about what they'd allowed to happen. She accepted it with the same composure she'd always carried. At the end of her first week as director, Katie walked through the trauma unit at shift change. A junior nurse stopped her, face flushed with uncertainty. "Dr. Morrison, I mean. Captain, I mean." The word stumbled and fell. Katie smiled. "Katie is fine." The nurse nodded, steadied herself, then asked about a procedure. Katie taught her with the same precision she'd once used in Kandahar, demonstrating hand positioning, explaining the physics of needle angle, showing how pressure and patience often solved problems that force couldn't touch. The junior nurse listened like someone learning from a prophet, because in that moment, in that fluorescent-lit hallway, that's exactly what Katie was, someone who'd survived erasure and returned to tell about it. Outside, the November sun was setting over Savannah, painting the sky in shades that reminded her of dust storms over the Hindu Kush. Katie touched her shoulder where the shrapnel scar was healing, a new mark added to the collection of old ones, each one a story that no one had been allowed to hear until now. She thought about the voice on the Pentagon line, the medals in the showbox, the moment her son decided she was worth fighting for. She thought about Dr. Pierce driving a supply van, about nurses who wouldn't meet her eyes, about the weight of secrets finally set down. If you like this story, please subscribe and hit the notification bell so you don't miss the next one. What would you have done in Katie's position? Drop a comment below, I read every single one. And if you know someone who's been invisible their whole life, someone whose worth wasn't recognized until the moment it mattered most, share this with them. Sometimes the bravest warriors carry stethoscopes, not guns.